Thank you so much, Leandra, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So as Leandra mentioned, today I'm going to present about my dissertation thesis. And the title of my dissertation, it's a little long. I omit one part because I'm still working in one of the chapters, but for today, I'm going to be presenting more about the interviews I made in Madre de Dios. So the title of my dissertation today is Factors Affecting Cultural Perceptions and Sustainability of Fund Management in Madre de Dios, Peru. And today I'm going to be talking about the design of my dissertation. And first, I'm going to start with the problem statement. Then I'm going to go into the theoretical approach, then the study case, my research questions, the methods, results, the conclusions, and implications and reflections. So my research specifically focused on the concerns in the factors that help explain perceptions in and management of different species of palms in Madre de Dios with regard to the sustainability of palm forest. And there are several changes in the region, or specifically in Madre de Dios, because the regional integration started happening years ago. And, in general, regional integration helps countries overcome divisions that impede the flow of goods, services, capital, people, and ideas. And these divisions are a constraint to economic growth, especially in developing countries like Peru. So this regional integration, as I mentioned, created changes in natural resource management, and these brought questions of sustainability, questions about how user groups view and manage resources, and questions about user groups, support of organizations, and market chains. So I'm going to start with a theoretical background. And so the first outcome of interest in my dissertation is conservation behavior. And this topic includes attitudes, beliefs, and perspectives on natural resources, and then also practices for natural resource management. Different social groups have different perspectives, and which therefore will influence the natural resource management practices. And however, some perspectives may change over time, which raises questions about the consequences for resource management practices. So in addition, the attribution of certain perspectives to certain groups may or may not be accurate. So I am using this term ABPs, which includes all these factors, attitudes, beliefs, and perspectives, but I'm going to be calling today perspectives because it's very long, no? So going to the next. So in general, there are several cultural theories that influence perspectives. I'm going to be focusing on three theories. And so these three theories are sense of place, identity, and traditional ecological knowledge. And how these three theories are going to influence then perspective, and then later are going to influence natural resource management. So let me change here okay. So the first theory is sense of place, which essentially is how social groups attach meanings to places. And those meanings influence their attitudes, beliefs, and perspectives about natural resource management in those places. And in general, social groups with a strong place attachment or sense of place may adopt attitudes, beliefs, and practices that prompt sustainable resource management practices. Then the second theory I'm focusing on is identity. Identity is essentially other aspects of identity beyond sense of place that can influence perspectives about natural resources. So these include region of origin, religious background, previous occupation, parental identity, etc. And whereas sense of place refers to current place of residence, other aspects of identity stem from place of origin, which may be different. So identity is likely to be important for social groups who are migrants or colonists. Then the third theory that I'm focusing in is traditional ecological knowledge, which is the evolving knowledge found acquired by social groups through direct contact with natural resources. So greater traditional ecological knowledge may influence perspectives to result in more sustainable natural resource management practices. And this traditional ecological knowledge may be a consequence of a sense of place and identity, as both influence perspectives about natural resources. And for example, groups of long-term residents with a strong sense of place may have greater traditional ecological knowledge, or for example, groups of migrants with a strong identity with a region of origin may have limited traditional ecological knowledge in their current place of residence. So I needed to confirm these theories that then later will inform my research questions. And so I also, beyond cultural perspectives on conservation behavior, are institutional approaches. So I also review other literature. And the other part of this literature review I made is focus on community-based natural resource management that shows how community organization, institutions, and conflicts can influence perspectives and natural resource management. So in addition, I work on stakeholders beyond communities, like government agencies and NGOs, and product buyers indicate other influence on natural resource management. So then I also continue with this topic, community-based natural resource management, characteristics and community institutions influence perspectives in natural resource management with implications for sustainability of management practices. And within this topic, work on community forest management also focuses on community organization and institutions as they influence forest management, often as part of broader livelihood strategies. Community forest management includes both timber management as well as non-timber forest products for households or community use and for selling in markets. Then also I'm focusing on different stakeholders. In general, the multi-stakeholder approach to environmental governance highlight how different stakeholder groups have different perspectives and natural resource management practices. Because a stakeholder may interact in important ways to influence perspectives and these natural resource management practices in communities. Also, governmental agencies have extension programs, NGOs have technical knowledge, product buyers seek agreements to acquire natural resources for selling markets. And all of these stakeholders seek to influence communities in terms of perspectives and natural resource management practices, including in terms of their sustainability. So now I'm gonna start talking about my study case. So my study was done in Madre de Dios, which is an Amazon region of Peru, which is limited with Brazil and Bolivia. It's called the MAP area. And this area has a high biodiversity and significant forest resources. And this department, Madre de Dios, is a department that is undergoing a regional integration a long time ago. And so forest resources in these regions include palm forest, which yield important non-timber forest products. And what are non-timber forest products are biological materials other than timber that are extracted from forests for human use. And usually they are a large part of the forest economy of developing countries like Peru. And indigenous groups and other long-standing population exhibit perspectives and natural resource management practices in forest management, including of palms. So Madre de Dios is being economically integrated also because more than 10 years ago, there was a construction of the Interoceanic Highway that goes from the border from Brazil through Madre de Dios and to other parts of Peru to the Pacific ports. And this highway paving stimulated rapid migration to Madre de Dios from the Andean highlands of Peru. And there is a rapid change in natural resource management, including deforestation, changes in forest management, and new forms of natural resource management, including non-traditional and illegal activities. An example of these illegal activities are deforestation and illegal gold mining. And in this area are really damaging all the forest. So regional integration involves cultural and institutional changes. And Madre de Dios is a good place to, I thought it was a good place to address these issues, because in Madre de Dios there has been a high migration, specifically from people from the Andes, that I'm gonna call Andean colonists, who came from the highlands where agricultural land use is intensive, and they went to the Amazon where the forest is dense, so they have to change their management practices or adapt to that forest. So because in general, migrant populations bring highland identities that affect perspectives and natural resource management practices. And I go to the next one. So as I mentioned, I am focusing on palms in this study in this region. Because palms are important for the lives of people in the region today and historically. They are a prominent feature of many landscapes in the Amazonia, and they are important culturally, economically, and they possess a variety of ecological roles that they play. And there are several species in the Amazon that are very abundant. And I chose this resource because this resource is changing. As I mentioned, new migration of people is bringing new practices, and a lot of people is clearing forests for agriculture. And in indigenous communities, some traditional ecological knowledge is being lost because people are changing their practices. Migration of new users groups bring new cultural assumptions. There is a big deforestation for several illegal activities, as I mentioned. And specifically, there is one species of palm that I include in my study that is being damaged by illegal mining, because people think that in these areas, there is big sediments of gold. So the 3 palms of my study are well known in the Amazon, and they are well consumed in this region. The first one is called Oenocarpus batagua, that's the scientific name, and it's called Ungurahua in Peru, Patagua in Brazil, and Majo in Bolivia. Then we have Mauritia flexuosa, which is well known as Aguaje in Peru, Burichi in Brazil, and Palma real in Bolivia. And it grows in near swamps and other wet areas. They are called aguajales specifically. And then I focus on Euterpe precatoria. It's known as Huasaí or Palmito in Peru, and Azaí in Brazil, and Azaí in Bolivia. And this is I will say, the well-known palm worldwide. Even here in Gainesville, you can find some products of Euterpe precatoria. And so the uses of these palms are basically for consumption. Their fruits are for consumption. Their oils are for cosmetic products. They also use the leaves and the stems for construction in some indigenous communities. They are also used for medicine. And they have a wide use in the Amazon. So now I'm gonna go into my research questions. I developed 4 research questions. The first one is, how do perception of management practices of the 3 species I mentioned between different indigenous communities and Andean colonies in Madre de Dios? And how do sense of place and identity influence how indigenous communities and Andean colonies view of forest landscape and their management of palms in Madre de Dios? And how do NGOs and government agencies working with palm projects affect the way indigenous communities and Andean colonies manage palms and market palm products in Madre de Dios? And how do buyers and community engage with NGOs and government agencies to procure palm products from communities, and how they see the market for palm products now and going forward in Madre de Dios? And then my last question that is still in progress, I'm still working on that, so I'm not going to talk about this, but is related to how the spatial distribution of the different palm species related to the spatial distribution of deforestation in Madre de Dios. So I'm going to talk about now about the methods I use for my research. So I focus on social science approach because it's focused on the inquiry on with indigenous communities and Andean migrants about perspectives and natural resource management practices, and is focused on other stakeholders that, like I mentioned, government agencies, NGOs, product buyers. And I use a qualitative approach to my data collection because it's necessary adequately capture diversity in stakeholder perspectives, and it's important for understanding the details of natural resource management practices, including how they may be changing, and is well suited to document cultural values about sense of place and identity, as well as institutional arrangements and relationships among stakeholders. So then within my sampling strategies, I focus first on geographic and cultural sampling selection of communities that were committed to management of palms. And I also chose culturally diverse communities, specifically indigenous communities and the Andean migrants. And then I also use a purposive sampling selection of key informants. Specifically, I chose long-time residents, community leaders, governmental leaders, NGO leaders, and product buyers for firms and communities. And I choose key informant interviewees and long-time residents because they are people who are in a position to speak for larger groups. And I needed to talk to leaders because they understand the history and practices that better than anybody else. And then the other part of my method include participant observation. So over 2 months period, I visited indigenous communities, Andean communities, NGOs, different government agencies, and different product buyers of palms. I did 55 semi-structured interviews. And within these interviews, I also observed cultural differences within the different indigenous communities and Andean colonies communities. When I went to the field to observe how they manage their palms, and also I wrote analytical memos. And when I did the interviews, I recorded the interviews anonymously. Okay, so how I did my semi-structured interviews. So I interview specifically 3 groups, and the first one are the indigenous communities. And so I specifically asked them about their perspectives regarding palms and palm forest, their natural resource management practices regarding palms, as how they plant, how they cut, how they harvest, sense of place and group identity as related to palms, community organization as related to palms as well, relationships with government agencies and NGOs, and relationships with product buyers concerning palm products. I interview 18 people, 6 female and 12 male. And then I also interview government agencies and NGOs. And the questions I did to them were related to their palm projects, specifically issues on sustainability, productivity, accessibility, and markets. I interviewed 25 people. And then I also interview buyers and communities that work with palms and sell and buy palms. And I talk about the importance of palm products in their businesses, how they engage with NGOs and government agencies to acquire palm products from communities, and how they see the palm market now and in the future. And I interviewed 12 people. So then the other part of my analysis, or the methods, include the coding and analysis of my data. So I transcribed the audio recording in verbatim, and then I did translations from Spanish to English, and I code my interviews in MaxQDA. And then the key themes for coding were focused on perspectives and natural resource management practices. Also, I focus on sense of place, identity, community organization, outside stakeholder support, etc. And also, I include the implications in terms of sustainability of palm management. So the analysis of codes among stakeholders to address the research questions were, for the first research questions, I specifically thought about comparisons of indigenous and Andean communities' perspectives and comparisons of indigenous and Andean community natural resource management practices. For my second question, I include relationships between communities and governmental agencies, and relationships between communities and NGOs. And for my last question, I also focus on relationships between communities and product buyers. And so the first part of my dissertation is focused on cultural differences of palm management livelihoods in my two first questions. So the main results for this part that I found are that there are cultural differences in perspective of palms within indigenous communities and Andean colonies, And there are differences in management practices. There is a loss of identity, specifically in indigenous communities. And there is a strong sense of place. So for the first part, I found that there are cultural differences in perspectives in palms, with Andean Andean colonies and indigenous communities. For example, Andean colonies conserve for managing the palm trees sustainably. That's what this first interviewee is mentioning in summary in this, because you're gonna see that I extract some part of the interviews and I just put it here so you can read it and have a sense of what they think about, specifically in this part about cultural differences. And then in the case of indigenous community leader, he's saying that it's very difficult to preserve palms because they are tall trees, and to harvest the fruits they need, cut them down. So essentially, in terms of management practices, I thought there will be a traditional way that indigenous communities use palms, but what they do essentially, and what they told me what they have been doing, is cutting the palm when they wanted to harvest the fruits, or when they wanted to use, of course, the materials for construction. But there wasn't a very traditional way, like, for example, in the past, they mentioned that there was so many palms that they really didn't need to cut them. But because of deforestation and other, because the forest is being cleared, and sometimes when they need their produce of palms, they need to cut them if they don't possess equipment to harvest. The opposite with Andean colonies is that most of them, they have been trained, or they have learned how to climb the palm trees to extract the fruits. And so for them, specifically, it's important not to cut them, just to preserve them. So there is mainly two ways to manage the palm trees: cut them down or climb them. So, and also some indigenous communities mentioned that they are practicing reforestation. And yeah, so those are the main differences. And then in the case of indigenous communities, in several interviews, I found that there is a loss of identity, specifically traditional ecological knowledge about like medicinal purposes is being lost, and also uses, because younger generations are not interested in preserving their cultural values. And then I found that the sense of place, in terms of how they feel, where they live, and where they are, I found that both groups have a strong sense of place, because they feel happy and in peace in their forests, and they think it's important for their future generations. So this was very interesting to see, that they really feel good in their place where they live. And in general, the conclusions for this part of my dissertation are that indigenous communities are not using traditional practices, and Andean colonies are managing better their palms, or because they are climbing, they are not cutting them. And this is important because we see that indigenous are doing the opposite than that we thought, or than I thought. And so then traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous communities are being lost, because the new generations are not interested in staying and live in their communities. And Andean colonies feel identified with their forests because they feel committed with conservation, and it provides them an income in long term. So most of the Andean colonies I interviewed mentioned that their first thought about working with palms was conserving the forest, because the illegal mining is taking over the forest. And then they realized that they could have business working with palms. And so if they conserve their palms, they will continue having their businesses in the long term. And then in the second part of my analysis, I analyze the impact of NGOs and government agencies of palm management perception in communities. And the main results are that NGOs and government agencies have similar objectives in terms of palm projects. And also I analyze the impacts of NGOs and government agencies in indigenous communities and Andean colonies. And the indigenous communities and Andean colonies mention that they have mixed feelings about these institutions. So as I mentioned, in general, NGOs and government agencies have similar objectives, but sometimes they will differ, of course, in terms of their mission and vision. Both institutions seek for a sustainable use of palm. And I will say that government agencies in general focus more on research and the control of palm populations. And the NGOs are more focused on forest conservation to use resources in a sustainable way, in specifically working with communities. So they can realize that they could have an income if they preserve them. And then in terms of how indigenous communities and Andean colonies think or feel about NGOs and government agencies, they have mixed feelings, as I mentioned. So for instance, the negative feelings that both mention is that government agencies and NGOs don't provide them enough training. For example, if the funding finish, then there is no continuation, so they feel abandoned. And then there is positive feelings in terms of they really thank these institutions because they were able to see, in many cases, economic opportunities, with palms. And then the main conclusion for this chapter is that indigenous communities and Andean colonies see NGOs and government agencies as agents that can help improve their livelihoods. However, in many instances, they feel abandoned because they cannot advance more in their technical knowledge. And then the last part of my interview analysis is focused on market views of palms. And the main results I found is that there are several issues in the market chain, such as accessibility, transportation, distance, products are seasonal, there is issues in terms of quantity and quality. And so these issues is because the markets are dynamics as well. And so the market chain present many difficulties to develop an adequate market. With economic integration, markets are constantly changing and the demand is increasing. Sometimes communities don't have enough products and good quality products to sell. So therefore, buyers sometimes can't buy enough products to supply the demands of their markets. And in this chapter, the main conclusions in terms, for example, the buyers mentioned that they need a consistent amount of farm products to satisfy the demand in the market, and they need quality farm products. And communities mentioned that there is big issues in terms of accessibility to harvest their palms. For example, sometimes these where they have their palms are in areas that the access is very remote, and sometimes they don't have transportation. And so this is a big problem for them, you know? And in general, I have three main conclusions for all these three chapters that I talk about. So in the first question, my general conclusion is that cultural factors behind perspectives in natural resource management are not as straightforward as we may think. Culture is dynamic regarding perspectives and natural resource management. So these groups, indigenous communities and Andean colonies possess no different identities, and we thought we understood these identities, in my case specifically, no? But in general, I should not assume about identity or sense of place or traditional ecological knowledge and how they relate with perspectives and natural resource management. And then in the second chapter, and my general conclusion is that government agencies and NGOs and communities, specifically collaboration is hard to begin and specifically to sustain. And these stakeholders need to devote time and effort to listen to each other in order to benefit each other. And then the last conclusion is that market dynamics make it very hard to sustain relationship between communities and buyers. And there are some implications of my study. Definitely there is a need to have a better organization, collaboration. There is a need to learn how to build trust and to learn, develop good communication between the different stakeholders. And it's very important to understand how cultural influence management practices and the use and marketing of palm products. And my study is an interdisciplinary approach that could help develop better policies to sustainable forest management, specifically with palms and rural livelihoods in the Amazon. And then I have some few reflections of my fieldwork. Oh, there is many things, of course, I learned, and I think everybody who carry out research independently is a very enriching experience, no? And so in general, my research was very important because it helped me grow personally and professionally. I learned how to do a research on my own. And also it was crucial that in the past I worked in this region. I forgot to mention that. And I had a good network, I will say. And when I came back, it was nice, you know, to reconnect with people I met in the past. And these people also led me to meet other people. And that's how my interviews were, in a way, they flow, no, in a good way. And so definitely having long ties in the region was crucial to develop relationships and be able to do my interviews. And in general, this is a new approach I took for a research because I'm a biologist. So in the past, I worked a lot with plants and I did measures, and it was a different approach because this was a social approach, no? And I realized that you learn a lot by talking with people. And so I want to say thank you to a lot of institutions within UF that helped me to go ahead and develop my dissertation. The TCD community, of course, has been always very important as a graduate student, because it provided me a home. I will say, this community is so amazing. And I want to thank my advisor, my committee members, and all the friends and family, that have always been supporting me. So thank you so much. And if you have any question, comments, recommendation, please go ahead. Thank you.